I used to believe that love could conquer everything. That family meant something sacred, something unbreakable. That blood ties and marriage vows created bonds stronger than steel. But I learned the hard way that when money is involved, family becomes nothing more than a business transaction, and love transforms into the sharpest weapon anyone can wield against you. My name doesn't matter anymore. What matters is what I discovered, what I lost, and what I was willing to do to get it back. This is the story of how I found out my perfect daughter-in-law was living a double life on OnlyFans, and how that discovery became the key to my revenge against a family that threw me away like yesterday's garbage. Before we begin this journey together, I want you to do something for me. If this story resonates with you, if you've ever felt betrayed by the people you trusted most, please hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. Your support means everything to storytellers like us who refuse to be silenced. Let me paint you a picture of what my life looked like before everything crumbled. I was Mrs. Patricia Hartwell, wife to Richard Hartwell, a man who built a small empire from nothing. Real estate, investments, a chain of successful restaurants across 3 states. We weren't billionaires, but we had enough money that our children would never want for anything. I thought I had earned my place in that world through 28 years of marriage, through raising his children, through standing by his side at countless business dinners where I smiled until my face hurt and made small talk with people who looked right through me. I lived in a beautiful colonial house with 6 bedrooms, a 3-car garage, and a garden that took 2 full-time landscapers to maintain. I drove a Mercedes that was replaced every 2 years like clockwork. I wore designer clothes that cost more than most people's monthly salary. From the outside, I had everything a woman could want. But luxury has a way of becoming a prison when you realize you're nothing more than an expensive accessory to someone else's success story. Richard never let me forget that the money was his. Every purchase I made, every decision about the house, every social engagement had to be approved by him. He controlled the accounts, monitored my spending, questioned every receipt. I told myself it was just his business mind at work, his need to keep track of every dollar. But deep down, I knew the truth. I was a kept woman, dependent on his generosity for every breath I took. Our daughter Sarah grew up watching this dynamic. She saw how her father treated me, how he dismissed my opinions, how he made all the important decisions while I nodded and smiled. And somewhere along the way, she learned to see me the same way he did, as someone whose value was measured entirely by what I could provide, whose worth diminished with every passing year. When Sarah announced her engagement to Marcus, I should have seen the warning signs. Marcus came from money, old money, the kind that whispers instead of shouts, that judges you by your bloodline rather than your bank account. His family had wealth that went back generations, the kind of aristocratic fortune that made Richard's self-made millions look like pocket change. At the engagement party, I watched Marcus's mother look at me with the same polite disdain I'd seen in country club bathrooms, that particular brand of condescension reserved for women who married into money rather than being born into it. But Sarah was radiant, and Marcus seemed to genuinely love her, so I pushed my concerns aside. I wanted my daughter to be happy, to have the kind of marriage I'd always dreamed of, one built on mutual respect and genuine partnership. I threw myself into wedding planning with the desperate energy of a woman trying to prove her worth. Through flower arrangements and seating charts, the wedding was spectacular. $30,000 for flowers alone. A dress that cost more than most people's cars, a reception for 300 guests at the most exclusive venue in the state. I planned every detail, managed every vendor, and smiled through every crisis. It should have been the proudest day of my life. But I remember standing in the back of the church, watching my daughter walk down the aisle, and feeling like I was watching my own funeral. After the wedding, things began to change rapidly. Richard's health started declining. Heart problems that he'd hidden from me for months. The medical bills began piling up. Expensive treatments and specialists that even our insurance couldn't fully cover. But that wasn't the real problem. The real problem was that while Richard was fighting for his life, someone was systematically destroying our financial foundation. I discovered later that Richard had been making increasingly risky investments, trying to grow our wealth quickly enough to secure our legacy. He'd leveraged everything: the house, the restaurants, even our retirement accounts. When those investments failed, we didn't just lose our profits. We lost everything. The man who'd spent decades building his empire had gambled it all away in a desperate attempt to leave his children more than they could ever spend. Richard died on a Tuesday morning in February. I was holding his hand when the machine stopped beeping, when the silence filled the hospital room like a living thing. But I didn't have time to grieve properly because the vultures were already circling. Lawyers, creditors, business partners who'd suddenly become strangers. They picked apart everything we'd built with the efficiency of surgeons. And when they were finished, I was left with nothing but debt and the clothes on my back. The house went first. 28 years of memories sold to satisfy creditors who showed up with briefcases full of papers I didn't understand. I had to watch strangers walk through my home, calculating the value of my life in square footage and market comparisons. The restaurants followed, liquidated to cover business debts that had been hidden from me behind corporate structures, and limited partnerships I'd never been allowed to understand. But the cruelest blow came from my own daughter. I went to Sarah and Marcus, expecting them to offer help, to give me somewhere to stay while I figured out how to rebuild my life. Instead, I found myself sitting in their pristine living room, a room that costs more to decorate than most people earn in a year, being lectured about financial responsibility and the importance of standing on my own 2 feet. "Mom," Sarah said, her voice carrying the same dismissive tone her father had perfected. "You can't expect us to bail you out of Dad's mistakes. Marcus and I have our own lives to think about, our own future to secure. You'll figure something out. You always do." Marcus nodded along, his expression a perfect mask of polite concern that fooled no one. "We're happy to help you find a nice apartment, Patricia. Something affordable, appropriate for your new situation. But we can't enable this kind of dependency. It wouldn't be good for any of us." I sat there listening to my daughter, the child I'd carried for 9 months, raised for 18 years, and loved unconditionally, explain why she couldn't spare even a fraction of her husband's family fortune to help her own mother avoid homelessness. The woman who'd spent $30,000 on wedding flowers couldn't find room in her budget to help the woman who'd given her life. That night, I found myself in a studio apartment that smelled like industrial carpet cleaner and other people's failures. One room, a kitchenette that barely deserved the name, and a bathroom with a toilet that ran constantly. The walls were thin enough that I could hear my neighbor's television through the plaster, could track the rhythm of their daily routines through the sounds of footsteps and running water. I'd gone from a 6-bedroom house to a space smaller than my former walk-in closet. I'd gone from having 2 full-time housekeepers to scrubbing my own toilet with dollar store cleaning supplies. I'd gone from being Mrs. Richard Hartwell to being just another middle-aged woman, invisible to the world around her. But the worst part wasn't the poverty or the loneliness. The worst part was the complete erasure of my existence from my daughter's life. No phone calls checking on my welfare. No invitations to holiday dinners. No acknowledgement that I was still alive and still her mother. I'd become an embarrassment, a reminder of failure that she preferred to pretend had never existed. I spent months in that apartment, surviving on Social Security payments that barely covered rent and groceries, watching my savings account, what little remained after the creditors finished with it, dwindle to nothing. I applied for jobs, but who wants to hire a 58-year-old woman whose only work experience consists of managing a household and organizing charity events? I was too old for most positions, too inexperienced for others, and too desperate for the few that remained. During those long, empty days, I found myself doing what millions of other forgotten people do. I lived online. Social media became my window into the world I'd lost. And unfortunately, my daughter's perfect new life. Sarah's Instagram account was a carefully curated showcase of luxury and happiness. Designer handbags, exotic vacations, restaurant meals that cost more than my monthly food budget. Every post was a reminder of what I'd lost. Every caption a cheerful celebration of a life that had no room for the woman who'd made it possible. But I noticed something else in those photos, something that gradually began to gnaw at the edges of my consciousness. Marcus was rarely in them. When he did appear, he looked distant, distracted, like a man going through the motions of happiness rather than actually experiencing it. Sarah, meanwhile, seemed to be trying too hard, smiling too brightly, posting too frequently, as if she were trying to convince herself as much as her followers that everything was perfect. I want to pause here and ask you something. I know this story is difficult to hear, but I need to know that people are listening, that my experience matters to someone out there. Please take a moment to comment below and let me know where you're watching from, your city, your country. Tell me you're here with me in this darkness, because sometimes that connection is the only thing that keeps us human. When everything else has been stripped away, that it was during one of my late-night social media binges, scrolling through Sarah's friends' accounts, that I stumbled across something that changed everything. I was looking at photos from a girls' night out, trying to recognize faces from Sarah's wedding, when I saw her. But this wasn't the Sarah I knew, the conservative, perfectly composed woman who'd married into old money and respectability. This was someone else entirely. The photo was tagged at a hotel bar downtown, one of those trendy places where cocktails cost $20, and everyone pretends to be more important than they actually are. Sarah was in the center of a group of women I didn't recognize, but something about her appearance was different. Her hair was styled in a way I'd never seen, darker and more dramatic. Her makeup was heavier, more provocative, and her outfit, a tight black dress that revealed more skin than I'd ever seen my daughter show in public, belonged to someone living a completely different kind of life, but it was her expression that really caught my attention. This wasn't the guarded, controlled smile she wore in her usual photos. This was raw, uninhibited joy, the kind of expression that comes from living without consequences, from having secrets that make you feel powerful and dangerous. I screenshot the photo and spent hours analyzing every detail, zooming in on faces, reading comments, trying to understand what I was seeing. That's when I noticed the username of one of the women commenting, at Sexy Secrets VIP. Her profile was private, but her bio contained a link to something that made my blood run cold, an OnlyFans account. I'd heard of OnlyFans, of course. Even isolated in my studio apartment, I wasn't completely cut off from popular culture. I knew it was a platform where people sold explicit content, where the boundaries between performer and audience dissolved in exchange for subscription fees and private messages. But I'd never imagined that world would intersect with my daughter's life. But curiosity is a dangerous thing when you have nothing left to lose. I created a fake account, used a prepaid credit card I'd bought with grocery money, and began exploring this hidden world that existed parallel to the respectable society my daughter claimed to inhabit. What I found was worse than anything I could have imagined. Not just the OnlyFans account, though that was devastating enough, but an entire secret identity that my perfect daughter had been cultivating behind her husband's back, behind everyone's back. She wasn't just posting explicit photos and videos for strangers. She was building relationships with her subscribers, engaging in private conversations that were far more intimate than anything I'd seen between her and Marcus. The account had thousands of subscribers, each paying monthly fees for access to content that became increasingly explicit as you moved through the subscription tiers. But it wasn't just about the money, though the amount she was making was staggering. It was about the control, the power, the ability to command attention and desire from hundreds of men who had no idea. They were fantasizing about someone who drove a BMW to church every Sunday. I spent weeks documenting everything: screenshots, saved videos, financial records that showed money flowing into accounts Marcus clearly knew nothing about. I traced the digital breadcrumbs of my daughter's double life with the methodical precision of a detective, building a case that would expose every lie she'd built her marriage on. But the more I discovered, the more I realized this wasn't just about revenge. This was about justice. Here was my daughter, living in luxury partly funded by money she was making by selling her body online, while her own mother lived in poverty just 20 minutes away. Here was the woman who'd lectured me about financial responsibility while secretly operating what was essentially a digital prostitution business behind her husband's back. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. The woman who'd been too respectable to help her own mother was degrading herself for strangers on the internet. The daughter who'd inherited her father's judgmental nature was living a life that would have disgusted him beyond measure. The wife who'd married into a family known for their moral superiority was engaged in behavior that would destroy their reputation if it ever became public. And that's when I realized what I had to do. This information wasn't just my daughter's secret to keep. It was my weapon to wield. I spent months planning my approach with the same careful attention I'd once devoted to charity, galas, and dinner parties. This wasn't going to be a simple confrontation or a moment of angry revelation. This was going to be a systematic campaign to reclaim everything that had been taken from me, to redistribute the wealth that should have been mine from the beginning. First, I hired a private investigator, a man who specialized in digital forensics and had experience with cases involving online adultery. I paid him with money I should have used for groceries. But some investments are worth the sacrifice. His job was to document everything legally, to create a paper trail that would hold up in court, to build an airtight case that no lawyer could dismiss or discredit. Then I contacted a divorce attorney, one with a reputation for representing scorned wives in high-asset cases. I explained that I had information that would be valuable in the right circumstances, that I was willing to share what I knew in exchange for a percentage of any settlement. That resulted. He was intrigued enough to agree to an initial consultation, and when I showed him the evidence I gathered, his eyes lit up like a slot machine hitting jackpot. But the most important step was psychological. I had to prepare myself for war, for a battle that would destroy whatever remained of my relationship with my daughter forever. I had to accept that I was choosing money over love, revenge over reconciliation, justice over family harmony. And the truth is, after months of being treated like I didn't exist, it wasn't a difficult choice to make. The opening salvo came on a Thursday morning in October. I called Sarah and asked to meet for coffee. Told her I had some important things to discuss about my financial situation. She agreed reluctantly, probably expecting another plea for help that she could dismiss with the same cold efficiency she'd perfected. We met at a cafe in the shopping district where she liked to spend her afternoons, surrounded by the kind of expensive boutiques that catered to women with unlimited budgets and limited imagination. Sarah arrived 15 minutes late, dressed in an outfit that probably cost more than my monthly rent, carrying a handbag that could have paid my utilities for 6 months. She ordered a $20 salad and barely touched it, spending most of the conversation checking her phone and making it clear that she had better places to be. When I finally brought up my financial struggles, her response was predictably dismissive. "Mom, we've talked about this, Marcus, and I can't keep supporting every crisis in your life. You need to find your own solutions, make your own way. That's what responsible adults do." That's when I pulled out my phone and showed her the first screenshot. I'll never forget the way her face changed when she recognized herself in that photo. The color drained from her cheeks so quickly I thought she might faint. Her hand trembled as she reached for the phone, as if she could somehow delete the evidence by touching the screen. "Where did you get this?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the cafe's background noise. "The internet," I replied calmly, sliding my phone back into my purse. It's amazing what you can find when you know where to look, and even more amazing what you can do with information once you have it. The next 30 minutes were unlike any conversation I'd ever had with my daughter. She tried denial first, claiming the photos were fake, that someone was trying to frame her. When that didn't work, she moved to justification, telling me it was just harmless fun, that everyone was doing it, that I wouldn't understand because I was from a different generation. Finally, she arrived at desperation, begging me to keep quiet, promising to help with my financial situation if I would just forget what I'd seen. But I wasn't interested in her promises or her explanations. I was interested in results. "Here's what's going to happen," I told her, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. "You're going to transfer $50,000 into my account by the end of the week. You're going to set up a monthly payment of $5,000 that will continue indefinitely, and you're going to do it quietly, without involving Marcus or anyone else." "I can't do that," she stammered. "Marcus controls the accounts. He'd notice that kind of money missing. Then you'll need to find a way to make it work," I replied, "because if you don't, I'll be having a very different conversation with your husband on Monday morning, along with his family, your friends, and anyone else who might be interested in seeing what you've been doing." to supplement your household income. Sarah's face cycled through a dozen different emotions: rage, fear, calculation, desperation. She was learning what it felt like to be powerless, to have someone else hold all the cards in a game where the stakes were everything you cared about. "You're my mother," she said finally, tears starting to form in her eyes. "How can you do this to me?" "I'm doing exactly what you taught me to do," I replied, standing up and leaving money on the table for my coffee. "I'm taking care of myself, making my own way, being a responsible adult. Isn't that what you wanted?" The first payment appeared in my account exactly 1 week later. $50,000 transferred from an account I didn't recognize, cleared and available for immediate withdrawal. I stared at that number on my banking app for a long time, watching those zeros that represented more money than I had access to since Richard's death. But this was just the beginning. Over the next several months, I systematically documented every aspect of Sarah's double life, building a comprehensive file that included not just the OnlyFans content, but the financial records, the secret communications with subscribers, the carefully constructed lies that kept her two worlds separate. I had enough evidence to destroy her marriage, her social standing, and her access to Marcus's family fortune. The monthly payments continued, but they weren't enough. $5,000 was a significant amount for someone in my position, but it barely scratched the surface of what I'd lost when my life collapsed. More importantly, it didn't address the fundamental injustice of my situation. My daughter was living in luxury while I scraped by in poverty, and that imbalance needed to be corrected more dramatically. That's when I decided to escalate the campaign. Using the private investigator's research, I identified several other men who were regularly featured in Sarah's online content. Men who weren't her husband. Men who were clearly part of her secret life in ways that went beyond simple financial transactions. I documented their identities, their own family situations, their potential vulnerabilities if their associations with my daughter became public knowledge. But more importantly, I discovered that Sarah wasn't the only one in her social circle engaged in this kind of activity. Several of her friends had similar online presences, similar secret revenue streams, similar exposure if the wrong person found out about their activities. This gave me leverage not just over my daughter, but over an entire network of wealthy women who had much to lose if their secrets became public. I began making contact with these women one by one, not to blackmail them directly. That would have been illegal, and I was careful to stay on the right side of the law, but to let them know that I was aware of their situations, that I understood their vulnerabilities, and that I might be interested in certain business arrangements that could be mutually beneficial. Some of them panicked and cut off all online activities immediately. Others tried to buy my silence outright, but a few were smart enough to realize that I represented an opportunity rather than just a threat. They understood that someone with my knowledge and my motivation could be a valuable ally in protecting their interests and maintaining their secrets. Within 6 months, I'd established what could only be described as a protection network. Wealthy women paying monthly fees for my discretion, for my services in monitoring and managing their online exposure, for my expertise in keeping their digital lives separate from their real-world identities. I wasn't blackmailing anyone. I was providing a legitimate service that they desperately needed and were willing to pay premium prices to obtain. The money started flowing in amounts I'd never imagined, not just from Sarah, but from a dozen other women who understood that their lifestyles depended on maintaining carefully constructed facades. I moved out of the studio apartment and into a respectable two-bedroom condo. I bought a reliable car, decent clothes, furniture that didn't come from thrift stores. I wasn't wealthy, but I was comfortable in a way I hadn't been since Richard's death. But Sarah wasn't finished fighting. After months of making payments and watching me rebuild my life with money that indirectly came from her secret activities, she decided to take a more aggressive approach. She hired her own investigators, trying to find leverage she could use against me. She consulted with lawyers about the legality of my business model. She even considered confessing everything to Marcus, hoping that honesty might provide better protection than continued secrecy. That's when I played my final card. I didn't just have evidence of Sarah's OnlyFans activities. I had evidence of tax evasion, of unreported income that she'd been hiding from both her husband and the IRS. I had documented proof that she'd been using Marcus's family connections and social standing to enhance her online brand, essentially monetizing his reputation without his knowledge or consent. And most devastatingly, I had evidence of her relationships with some of her subscribers that went far beyond digital interaction. The confrontation that followed was the most brutal conversation I'd ever had with another human being, let alone my own daughter. It took place in my new condo on a Saturday afternoon when Marcus thought Sarah was at a spa weekend with her girlfriends. She sat on my couch, a couch purchased with money that had originated from her secret life, and listened as I laid out exactly how much evidence I had and exactly what I was prepared to do with it. "You have a choice," I told her, spreading printed photographs across my coffee table like a dealer arranging cards. "You can continue trying to fight me, in which case all of this becomes public knowledge and you lose everything you've worked to build. Or you can accept the new reality and work with me to find a solution that protects both of our interests." Sarah stared at the photos for a long time, her face cycling through expressions of horror, rage, and calculation. These weren't just screenshots from her OnlyFans account. These were images from private meetings, from hotel rooms, from situations that proved her online activities had extended into real-world adultery. Her secret life wasn't just about money. It was about a complete double identity that involved betraying her marriage vows in the most intimate ways possible. "What do you want?" she asked finally, her voice hollow with defeat. "I want what should have been mine from the beginning," I replied. "I want financial security. I want respect. I want recognition that I sacrificed my entire adult life for this family and deserve better than being thrown away when circumstances changed. And I want you to understand that actions have consequences, that treating people like they're disposable eventually makes you disposable too." The agreement we reached that day was complex and comprehensive. Sarah would establish a trust fund that guaranteed me a comfortable income for the rest of my life. She would provide me with a suitable home in a respectable neighborhood. She would include me in family functions and social events, restoring my status as her mother rather than treating me like a shameful secret. And in exchange, I would maintain her confidentiality and use my network to help protect her online activities from discovery by Marcus or his family. I served my time in a minimum security facility designed for white-collar criminals, surrounded by other women who'd made catastrophic decisions in pursuit of money or power or revenge. We were all the same, really, people who'd started with legitimate grievances but had allowed our anger and our desperation to corrupt us beyond recognition Prison gave me time to think, to really examine what I'd done and why I'd done it. I realized that my campaign for justice had never really been about justice at all. It had been about power, about proving that I mattered. In a world that had decided I didn't, I'd been so focused on making other people pay for the pain they'd caused me that I'd lost sight of who I was becoming in the process. When I was released, I found myself in a situation eerily similar to where I'd started this journey. I was alone, with limited financial resources, living in subsidized housing designed for people transitioning back into society after incarceration. But this time, there was no family to blame for my circumstances, no one else responsible for the choices that had led me to this point. Sarah had divorced Marcus during my incarceration. The stress of the investigation and the revelation of her secret life had destroyed their marriage beyond repair. She'd lost access to his family's wealth, lost her social standing, lost most of her friends who'd discovered her role in what the media had dubbed the OnlyFans extortion ring. She was living quietly in another state, working a regular job, trying to rebuild her life without the luxury and status that had once defined her identity. We never spoke again. The restraining order remained in effect, but even if it hadn't, I'm not sure either of us would have known what to say. We'd destroyed each other so thoroughly that there was nothing left to salvage. No relationship worth rebuilding from the wreckage of our mutual betrayal. Now I'm 63 years old, living on disability payments in a small apartment that smells like industrial carpet cleaner and other people's failures. I spend my days watching television, reading library books, and thinking about the choices that brought me here. The irony isn't lost on me. I'm back where I started, but this time I have no one to blame but myself. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd made different choices that day in the cafe when I first confronted Sarah. What if I'd used the information I'd discovered to facilitate reconciliation instead of revenge? What if I'd approached her with compassion instead of calculation, understanding instead of ultimatums? What if I'd remembered that she was still my daughter, still the little girl I'd once loved unconditionally, regardless of how she'd treated me in my darkest moment? But those are questions without answers, paths not taken, that lead nowhere except to more regret. The truth is that I was so consumed by anger, so desperate to feel powerful again, that I couldn't see any solution that didn't involve making other people pay for my pain. I'd been hurt, and I wanted to hurt back. Everything else, the money, the security, the elaborate justifications about justice and fairness, was just window dressing on a simple desire for revenge. The women I exploited during those 18 months have all moved on with their lives. As far as I know, some returned to their marriages and found ways to rebuild trust with their husbands. Others divorced and started over, freed from the exhausting burden of maintaining double lives. A few continued their online activities, but with better security and more honest financial arrangements. They survived my intrusion into their lives and found ways to heal from the damage I caused. But I remained trapped in the consequences of my choices, living with the knowledge that I became exactly the kind of person I'd once felt superior to. The woman who judged others for their moral failures, had engaged in systematic exploitation of vulnerable people. The mother who'd claimed to love her daughter unconditionally had destroyed that daughter's life for financial gain. The wife who'd prided herself on respectability had become a criminal who preyed on other women's shame and desperation. The worst part isn't the poverty or the loneliness or even the knowledge that I'll die alone and unmourned. The worst part is the understanding that everything I lost, my family, my security, my place in the world, was ultimately lost because of my own choices. Richard's financial failures created the crisis, but my response to that crisis created the catastrophe. I had opportunities to rebuild relationships, to find legitimate ways to improve my circumstances, to maintain my dignity while accepting help from people who might have been willing to provide it. Instead, I chose to wage war against the people who should have been my allies. I chose to see my daughter as an enemy rather than as someone who was also struggling with the aftermath of her father's death and the collapse of everything our family had built. I chose to interpret her initial rejection as a permanent condemnation, rather than as a temporary response to overwhelming circumstances, and in making those choices, I became someone who deserved the isolation and contempt I'd once fought so hard to escape. I became the kind of person who destroys families for personal gain, who exploits other people's vulnerabilities for profit, who turns love into a weapon and relationships into business transactions. I became everything I'd once claimed to be above. There are no heroes in this story, no clear lines between victims and perpetrators, no simple lessons about right and wrong. Sarah was cruel to abandon her mother in desperate circumstances, but I was crueler in my response to that abandonment. The women I exploited made questionable choices about their online activities, but I made worse choices about how to profit from their vulnerabilities. We all failed each other in different ways, and we all paid prices that exceeded our crimes. If there's anything I want people to understand from this story, it's that revenge is a luxury that poor people can't afford. When you're desperate, when you're hurt, when you feel like the world has abandoned you, the temptation to strike back can be overwhelming. But the satisfaction of making other people pay for your pain is temporary, while the consequences of those actions can last forever. I spent 18 months feeling powerful, feeling like I'd finally taken control of my circumstances and forced the world to treat me with the respect I deserved. But that feeling was built on a foundation of other people's suffering, and foundations like that never hold for long. Eventually, the weight of what you've done collapses everything you've built, leaving you worse off than when you started. The money I extracted from my victims is gone, seized by the government and returned to the people I'd wronged. The comfortable life I'd briefly enjoyed is a memory. That makes my current circumstances more painful rather than less. The power I'd wielded over other people's lives has been replaced by powerlessness that's absolute and permanent. I traded temporary satisfaction for permanent exile, brief triumph for lasting shame. But perhaps most tragically, I lost the one thing that might have made all the other losses bearable. I lost my daughter, not to death or distance or natural drift, but to choices I made deliberately and repeatedly. I turned the love between a mother and daughter into a weapon, and in doing so, I destroyed the only relationship that could have given meaning to the years I have left. Sarah is somewhere out there, building a new life without me, and she's probably better off for my absence. She's learned hard lessons about the consequences of secret lives and double identities, about the importance of honesty in relationships, about the dangers of letting shame and fear drive your decisions. She's paid a heavy price for those lessons, but she's young enough to apply them constructively. She has time to rebuild, to find new love, to create the kind of authentic life that doesn't require elaborate deceptions to maintain. I don't have that time. At 63, with a federal conviction on my record and no family ties to anchor me, my opportunities for reinvention are limited. I'm not looking for sympathy. I made my choices with full knowledge of the risks involved, and I accepted those risks because the potential reward seemed worth the potential consequences. But I was wrong about the math. The costs have far exceeded any benefits, and the debt I've accumulated in terms of relationships and reputation can never be repaid. This is what a hollow victory looks like. This is what happens when you win a war against your own family and discover that the spoils of victory are worthless without people to share them with. This is the price of choosing revenge over reconciliation, power over love, justice over mercy. I tell this story not because I expect forgiveness or understanding, but because I hope that somewhere, someone else who's facing similar choices might learn from my mistakes. When life destroys everything you've built, when the people you love treat you like you're disposable, when you feel like the only way to regain control is to make other people pay for your pain, remember that revenge is a fire that burns everything it touches, including the person who lights the match. But the most important part of our agreement was psychological. Sarah had to acknowledge what she'd done to me, had to admit that her treatment of me after Richard's death had been cruel and unjustified. She had to apologize not just for cutting me off financially, but for cutting me out of her life emotionally, for treating me like I was worthless simply because I was no longer useful. That apology, delivered through tears in my living room, was worth more than any amount of money she could have given me. It was acknowledgement that I mattered, that I deserved better, that my years of sacrifice and service to the family meant something, even when the family's circumstances changed. The months that followed were strange and complicated. Sarah and I developed a relationship that was part mother-daughter, part business partnership, part mutual blackmail society. We had dinner together once a week, carefully maintaining the appearance of a reconciled family while both of us knowing that our connection was built on secrets and leverage rather than love and forgiveness. Marcus remained oblivious to the dramatic changes in our family dynamics. As far as he knew, Sarah had simply realized she'd been too harsh with me and decided to provide financial support out of generosity and family loyalty. He occasionally expressed surprise at my improved circumstances, but Sarah had become expert at managing his questions and directing his attention away from topics that might lead to dangerous discoveries. But living with this kind of secret knowledge changes you in ways you don't expect. I found myself constantly analyzing people's behavior, looking for signs of hidden lives and concealed motivations. I became suspicious of everyone's public persona, wondering what secrets they might be hiding, what vulnerabilities they might be trying to protect. The world started to look like a stage full of actors, each playing roles that had little connection to their authentic selves. More troubling was the realization that I'd become someone I didn't recognize. The woman who'd once prided herself on moral superiority, who judged others for their failures and weaknesses, was now profiting from those same failures and weaknesses. I was taking money from women who were degrading themselves online, helping them maintain lies that were destroying their marriages and families. I'd become exactly the kind of person I'd once looked down upon. But the alternative was returning to that studio apartment, to the poverty and invisibility that had nearly destroyed me. And I wasn't strong enough or noble enough to make that choice voluntarily. I'd tasted financial security again, felt the relief of being able to pay bills without anxiety, experienced the dignity that comes from being treated like you matter. I couldn't give that up, even if keeping it required compromising everything I'd once believed about right and wrong. The turning point came almost 18 months after my initial discovery of Sarah's secret life. I was managing the online presence of nearly 24 women, collecting monthly fees that had grown substantial enough to provide me with genuine wealth, rather than just comfort. I'd become an expert in digital security, in reputation management, in the art of maintaining multiple identities across various online platforms. What had started as blackmail had evolved into a legitimate business serving a clientele that desperately needed my services. But success brought its own problems. The more money I made, the more visible I became. The more clients I served, the greater my exposure to discovery by law enforcement or investigative journalists, and the more deeply involved I became in my clients' secret lives. The more I knew about activities that went far beyond simple adult content creation. Some of my clients were involved in activities that were genuinely criminal. Tax evasion was just the beginning. I'd discovered evidence of fraud, embezzlement, even connections to organized crime figures who were using online platforms to launder money and recruit assets. I'd created a network that gave me access to information that could destroy dozens of lives and expose criminal enterprises worth millions of dollars. That's when I realized I'd gained something more valuable than money or security. I'd gained power, real, substantial power over people whose influence extended far beyond their online personas. I was no longer just Sarah's mother seeking revenge for mistreatment. I was a player in a much larger game, someone whose knowledge and discretion were worth fortunes to people who had everything to lose. But power is a dangerous thing when you're not prepared to handle it responsibly. I started making demands that went beyond financial payments, started using my leverage to influence my clients' behavior in their real-world lives. I pushed them to make charitable donations to causes I supported, to use their social influence in ways that benefited my interests, to introduce me to other wealthy individuals who might become clients or allies. Sarah watched these developments with growing alarm. What had started as a private arrangement between mother and daughter had expanded into something that threatened to expose not just her secrets, but the secrets of everyone in her social circle. She was no longer just paying for her own protection. She was complicit in a systematic exploitation of her friends and acquaintances. This has to stop, she told me during one of our weekly dinners, her voice carrying a desperation I hadn't heard since our first confrontation. You're destroying people's lives. You're breaking up marriages, ruining families, driving women to nervous breakdowns. This isn't justice anymore. It's just cruelty. This is business, I replied, cutting my steak with the same precision I'd learned to apply to managing my clients' vulnerabilities. These women made choices, and choices have consequences. I'm simply helping them manage those consequences in exchange for fair compensation. Fair compensation? Sarah's voice rose loud enough that other diners started looking in our direction. You're taking thousands of dollars from women who are desperate and terrified. You're profiting from their shame and their fear. How is that different from any other kind of exploitation? It's different because I'm not creating their problems, I said calmly. I'm not forcing them to live double lives or engage in activities that threaten their marriages and reputations. I'm simply providing a service they need at prices they're willing to pay. If they don't like the arrangement, They're free to stop their online activities and eliminate their need for my services. But even as I said those words, I knew they weren't entirely true. The system I'd created had its own momentum now, its own logic that went beyond simple market transactions. My clients weren't just paying for protection. They were trapped in a web of mutual dependence that made escape increasingly impossible. The more they paid me, the more they had to maintain their online activities to afford the payments. The more money they made online, the more they needed my services to avoid discovery. It was a cycle that enriched me while slowly destroying everyone else involved. The end came suddenly, the way these things often do. One of my clients, a woman whose husband was a prominent politician, decided she couldn't continue living with the stress of maintaining her secret life. Instead of simply stopping her online activities, she chose a more dramatic solution. She confessed everything to her husband, provided him with complete documentation of her activities and her payments to me, and asked him to help her expose what she described as an extortion network targeting vulnerable women. Within 72 hours, I was contacted by federal investigators who'd been building a case around online exploitation and financial crimes. They had recordings of conversations with my clients, copies of payment records, documentation of the systematic nature of my business model. They had evidence that I'd crossed the line from providing services to engaging in extortion, that I'd used threats and intimidation to maintain client relationships that had become involuntary. But more devastatingly, they had Sarah, faced with the choice between protecting me and protecting herself. My daughter chose to cooperate with the investigation. She provided testimony about how our arrangement had begun, how it had evolved from personal blackmail into a broader criminal enterprise, how I'd used her initial vulnerability to build a network that victimized dozens of other women. Sitting in that federal courtroom, listening to my own daughter describe me as a predator who'd exploited her shame and desperation for financial gain, I finally understood what I'd become. The woman who'd started this journey seeking justice for the way her family had treated her had transformed into someone who deserved the contempt she'd once fought against. The sentence was 18 months in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release. I was required to make full restitution to all identified victims, to surrender all assets acquired through my criminal activities, and to have no contact with any of my former clients. Most painfully, I was prohibited from contacting Sarah or Marcus during my period of incarceration, and they were granted restraining orders that would remain in effect indefinitely. The satisfaction of watching your enemies suffer is temporary, but the damage you do to yourself in the process is permanent. Choose differently. Choose better. Choose to rebuild rather than to destroy, to heal rather than to harm, to love rather than to hate. Because at the end of the day, the only person who can truly destroy your life is you, and the only person who can truly rebuild it is you. The rest is just noise, just distraction from the real work of figuring out how to live with dignity and purpose, even when everything you thought you knew about yourself and your place in the world has been stripped away. That's the hardest work any of us will ever do, but it's also the only work that really matters in the end. I failed at that work, spectacularly and completely, but maybe my failure can serve as a cautionary tale for someone else. Maybe my mistakes can help someone else make better choices when they find themselves standing at the same crossroads, where I chose destruction over healing. That's the only redemption I can hope for now that my story might prevent someone else from making the same catastrophic errors in judgment that turned me from a victim of circumstances into a perpetrator of cruelty. That somewhere, someone might read this and decide to choose love over hatred, forgiveness over revenge, reconstruction over destruction. Because in the end, those are the only choices that lead anywhere worth going. Everything else is just a slow spiral into the kind of isolation and regret that define my days now. Everything else is just another way of destroying yourself while pretending you're fighting back against a world that's already moved on without you. Before I close this story, I want to ask one final favor from those of you who've stayed with me through this difficult journey. If this tale has moved you, if you found value in my cautionary words, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to this channel. Your support helps ensure that stories like mine continue to be told, that the lessons learned from our failures can reach the people who need to hear them most. Thank you for listening, for bearing witness to my mistakes, and for allowing me to transform my pain into something that might serve a purpose beyond my own regret.